This is Boomer Life on CL 650.
Just move on up toward your destination.
And we're back. This is Boomer Life on CL 650. I'm Joanne Sutton. Thanks for joining us today. Here we are in the studio with Parkinson's Society BC's CEO, Jean Blake, whom we've spoken to earlier this hour about the work that the Society does and their mission to be the voice of British Columbians who are living with Parkinson's disease, to ease their burden and to hopefully find a cure. We also heard from Richard Mayede, who spoke of his work on the board of directors for the Society and what it's like to receive a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease and what it's like to live with it. Joining us now in the studio is Dr. Martin McKeown. Thanks for being here and joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure.
So there is no doubt, Dr. McKeown, that you are the resident expert for Parkinson's disease. Your bio reads like a textbook for physics, neurology, and neurobiology with degrees and masters and professional positions on both sides of the border for Canada and the U.S. Maybe you can tell us what hat you're wearing here with us today, what title that you carry that relates to Parkinson's disease right now.
Yes, well, currently I'm the director of the Pacific Parkinson's Research Center at UBC, and the PPRC, as we call it, is an interdisciplinary center that's dedicated towards excellence in research related to Parkinson's and also excellence in clinical care of people living with Parkinson's.
Okay, so Dr. McKeown, can we just cover some of the basics here? What are some of the early signs and symptoms of Parkinson's disease?
Yeah, well, actually, Parkinson's can often creep up on you very slowly. One of the earliest manifestations is actually a loss of smell, and some people don't immediately recognize that. Some people may have constipation, or they may actually act out their dreams even years before ultimately a diagnosis is made. But most of the time, people start to notice things such as a tremor in one hand, or they may be shuffling a little bit more, or perhaps people close to them notice that their face is showing less expression than it did before.
Wow, some of these precursors and symptoms are quite surprising to me. How are they all related? Smell and constipation and shuffling?
That's a very good question, and it's because we don't really know where the disease starts. It used to be assumed that the disease started in the brain, which was associated with control of movement, and that's why people presented initially with tremor and shuffling and so on. But now we're starting to think that it's possible the disease may actually start in the gut and may affect other parts of the brain, some of the sort of older primitive centers of the brain associated with smell and so on.
Very interesting. So can you tell us, if you don't know exactly where Parkinson's disease starts, how could the disease be diagnosed?
Well, that's actually quite a difficult question, and that's why I think Parkinson's should be diagnosed by a specialist, because it can actually be very difficult to diagnose, specifically because there are many conditions that look like Parkinson's but are not actually Parkinson's. So looking at all these constellation of signs is best interpreted by an expert in the field. And sometimes even the experts get it wrong. And one of the most important features is how well people respond to medication. People with Parkinson's disease, fortunately, tend to respond very well to medication, particularly in the early stages of the disease.
So at what point, if someone has any possible concerns, should they actually go and see a doctor?
I would say as soon as possible. Unfortunately, due to the situations in our province, the wait list can be quite long. But I think it's important to be assessed as soon as possible, because interventions are possible that can possibly slow the progression of the disease, and certainly treat some of the early symptoms that people may have.
So what types of, investigations are done to try to help determine that you have Parkinson's disease? It's not like a simple blood test.
No, unfortunately not, and that would make things a lot simpler. So there are many things that have been suggested as ways to assess it, but ultimately it boils down to clinical expertise. So a careful examination by an expert, possibly some ancillary tests such as an MRI scan and so on. These are the things that have to be taken together as a cohesive picture to come up with a firm diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like a very delicate and very lengthy process.
Well, it's not necessarily lengthy, but I think it requires expertise to make sure that the diagnosis is correct.
So, Dr. McKeown, can we talk a little bit about some of the areas of research that are currently being studied at the Pacific Parkinson's Research Center?
Yes, we have actually a very active research program, including different types of imaging of the brain of Parkinson's. We're looking at some of the genetics associated with Parkinson's. We're looking at ways to use new technologies to monitor disease progression, and we're even looking at sort of novel non-drug therapies. However, our most recent study, which is being headed up by my colleague, Dr. Cresswell, is we're actually looking at the microbiota of the gut in Parkinson's. And this is work that's being funded by the Parkinson's Society of Canada and also the Pacific Parkinson's Research Institute.
So what is microbiota?
So it turns out that we actually have trillions of cells that live inside our gut and on our skin. And in fact, we have more of these cells than we actually have human cells. And these are typically things like bacteria and so on that grow in our gut. We normally don't think much about them until they flare up and give us, for example, traveler's diarrhea, and then we become acutely aware of it. But in the past, these cells have mostly been ignored, and what we're discovering now is that they seem to be very important for health. And not only health of the gut, which is, I guess, fairly obvious, but health of the brain. And so there's something that's called the so-called gut-brain axis, where it turns out that the bacteria in the gut may secrete hormones and stuff that influence the brain, and this may be affected in disease.
I'm absolutely amazed that you've made that connection between the brain and the gut. We know in Western medicine that these are two areas that are extremely complicated and also extremely vulnerable because everybody's composition for every single living person on Earth are completely different. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about what you're looking at specifically in this research of the microbiota and how this may help people with Parkinson's.
Mm-hmm. Well, we think this is a particularly important area to investigate for many reasons. First, as we talked about before, it can be quite difficult to come up with a firm diagnosis. And so it's relatively easy to get a stool sample from someone and analyze the gut flora. And that may be one way we can use to track disease progression or use it for diagnostic purposes. But perhaps more excitingly is it raises the potential for treatment. Some preliminary studies have shown that there are certain bacteria that are only seen in people with Parkinson's but are not seen in people who don't have Parkinson's. Now, we're not sure whether or not these particular bacteria species are the cause or the result of the disease, but that's why we want to investigate this further. Because if it turns out there are certain bacteria that are associated with types of illness, it may be possible to target these with either specific antibiotics or types of probiotics, or even changing your nutrition, which I think is going to be a topic later.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's very important. When did you actually make this connection that your gut might have a connection to the disease?
Well, this has been kind of a growing area of research over the last decade or so. It's long been known that the gut had a very complicated flora, but I think it's just the recognition of how important this was to the rest of the body and the brain. That's what's really starting to become increasingly important and evident.
So do you think this is a baby step closer to finding a cure for Parkinson's disease?
Well, as I said, this is part of the clue that if it doesn't, in fact, start in the gut, which might be a possibility, then it might be one of the closest things to prevent the development of early symptoms. But it's certainly baby steps, as you say. This is the very, very early part of this. We first want to characterize what's different in the flora of the gut in people with Parkinson's compared to those who don't have it.
So, Dr. McKeown, is there anything else you can tell us about how some of the symptoms are treated? Is it medication? I know that you've touched a little bit on possible diet, fitness. Where are we with treatment of the symptoms of Parkinson's?
Well, we're fortunate that there are many, many treatments available. They can really be divided into broad categories. There's pharmacotherapy, which are medications that we use for people, and there's a number of them that have been available. The most common one is called levodopa, and we're now actually up to the 50-year anniversary of using this this medication. So we're very familiar with its pros and its potential side effects. Surgical treatment can sometimes be very effective for people. There's a procedure known as deep brain stimulation, and it can be effective to the particular individuals who meet the criteria. And then there's other things like exercise, as you alluded to. So exercise appears to be very important. And also there are other issues that come up. So, for example, there can be changes related to mood and cognition that also need to be addressed independently.
I'm going to ask you about medical marijuana because it's been a big issue in social media of late. Have there been studies that might indicate this helps as part of a treatment?
Well, I think it's early days yet for medical marijuana. The American Academy of Neurology has not endorsed it as of yet, but again, I think it's early days. There may be some aspects of the disease where it may be beneficial. So, for example, there are people who may experience weight loss. There are people who have anxiety, and the medical marijuana may be helpful for that. Occasionally, as a side effect of some of the medications, people may get involuntary writhing movements that are called dyskinesias, and the marijuana may help that. But there may be some downsides to marijuana. So, for example, one of the concerns about marijuana is that it may worsen apathy, where people just don't feel like doing anything. And that's already a big problem in Parkinson's. And in susceptible individuals, it may trigger psychosis. And so these are things that I think, should not be taken lightly. And I think you have to weigh the pros and cons of all potential therapies, including medical marijuana.
Mm-hmm. There's no slam dunk, is there?
I'm afraid not.
No. Is there anything else that you wanted to share with us today, Dr. McKeown, about where we're at and hope for the future?
Well, I would just like to get back to exercise because it has been promoted strongly by the Parkinson Society of British Columbia, and we do know that people who are more physically active tend to do better, especially over the long term. What is unclear, though, is exactly what type of exercise is the best, and it may have to be tailored to the individual. So, for example, it's been shown that exercises such as Tai Chi are very good for balance in Parkinson's. But we also know that if you want to sort of promote hormones that stimulate brain growth and brain repair, you have to have aerobic exercise and make sure that you sweat. So that's important. And the other thing I think I would mention is that some of the new technologies, like, for example, we're all familiar with Fitbits where people wear them. So something like that where we can monitor people throughout the day. I think that this will help us keep a closer eye on some of the signs and symptoms throughout the day and help people monitor their symptoms and track their symptoms a little bit better.
Well, Dr. McKeown, thank you so much for your contribution to today's show. I know you've been a great help in helping us understand Parkinson's disease a lot better and where we stand in finding a cure and treating symptoms and the current research that you're doing. Thanks very much for your help.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
You're listening to Boomer Life on CL 650. I'm Joanne Sutton. Today we're joined in studio with Parkinson's Society BC's CEO Jean Blake and also in studio Dr. Martin McKeown. You can always get more information about this online at parkinson.bc.ca. Now, you might be surprised to learn that there is a relationship with Parkinson's disease and your gut, your entire digestive system. We're about to find out more about that important connection that the food you eat has with the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. That's all coming up next on Boomer Life on CL 650.
Celebrating the baby boomer lifestyle. This is Boomer Life on CL 650.